Boston is the birthplace of American journalism, and that started in 1690, when we're talking about dirt streets.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. This program is brought to you in part by the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, which supports our First Amendment and Free Press program, where we take a look at the role of journalism in our democracy. I'm here today with Professor Manny Paraschos, who's a professor emeritus at Emerson College in Boston. Manny, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Manny, I wanted to have you on today because you've done a tremendous amount of research into various journalism sites in Boston and New England in particular, taking a look at the history of journalism in our region. And you've done a great deal of writing on Newspaper Row in particular, Newspaper Row being an area in and around Washington Street in Boston, where over the course of 2 centuries, there were a number of newspaper publishers that really had a profound impact on the journalism world that we see today. Can you start by telling us a little bit about what Newspaper Row looked like in its heyday, which was, correct me if I'm wrong, late 1800s, early 1900s? You know, what would you have seen if you were walking down Washington Street in Boston at that time?
You see a lot of people walking wearing hats. Men were wearing hats more than anything. It's a significant picture. Then people still riding horse buggies, getting tours for that. And a lot of activity. The area had at least 12, maybe 15 or 20 newspapers, large and small, of all colors. And the street level part of the operation normally would have windows behind which the newspaper men and women would write the news and put them against the window, so passers-by would be able to read the papers and gather and exchange views. So it was a very active part of Boston. So that was what it was like in that era. Of course, Boston journalism Boston is the birthplace of American journalism, and that started in 1690, when we're talking about dirt streets and horses, et cetera. But now we're moving forward to the early 1900s.
You're walking down Washington Street during this time, and you can look into the windows of the more than a dozen newspaper publishers that are there side by side. And in the windows, they have, a lineup of their top stories. So, I imagine at this time, people are walking down Washington, rather than even buying a newspaper, they're just walking down Washington Street to see the news, to look in the windows and get a better understanding of what's going on. Was a lot of that happening? And did it have that kind of energy?
Yes, it did. And energy is the right way to put it. It was a very active scene, but people were still buying newspapers. The Boston Post, which was at the time the premier newspaper in town, had one of the highest circulations in America, 600,000 people daily. Huge numbers. But also a lot of gimmicks, journalistic gimmicks at the time to raise circulation, and a lot of opinion. So people, the editorials were loud, and so that's it was energy, was a lot of energy in that part of town, and newspapers were the protagonists of all that activity.
You mentioned how loud it was. Tell us a little bit about the sounds at the time. We already know what we're looking at, what we're seeing, but what are we hearing as we're walking down Newspaper Row?
Well, I can only guess that people are arguing, people following the news, sports news, scores, boxing matches, and eventually the Globe started. And had an announcer who would announce the results of fights and describe the fight itself, boxing match. And so that kind of thing was what was going on. And it was a very, very active part of town.
And I envision this very lively, energetic, exciting scene. But how common was this in other cities? Did every other major city in the country have this strip where newspapers published, and you could get the same kind of experience, or was this unique to Boston?
No, New York was the other major hub of journalism at the time, but Boston was a close second.
And maybe compare the media landscape at that time to what we see now. The idea that you could have a dozen or more newspapers all publishing right next to each other on the same street in one city can seem very can be difficult to believe, given that most cities now, if they're lucky, have one daily
Oh my goodness,
newspaper.
yes. Yeah. 99.9% of American cities have only one paper. So yes, it was quite an exception at the time. And again, New York was the only other comparable scene. And it was a very important part of American history, in that the newspapers at the time, Boston newspapers, for example, the Post, which was the premier newspaper, as I said, is a paper that uncovered the Ponzi scheme. Carlo Ponzi was living here in Lexington, and they uncovered his scheme. It was a huge deal. They won the Pulitzer in 1921. But imagine that. I mean, there were people on Washington Street on Fridays waiting in line to deposit their paychecks to Carlo Ponzi, because he promised to double it X number of days, whatever. So yeah, it was a very, very active part, and for some very strange reasons. I mean, who would have thought? But there it is, Carlo Ponzi, a huge story in the world. And he was here, and he was covered, and he paid.
So you mentioned this incredible story about Ponzi. Pulitzer Prize was even won for the reporting, which really plays into the role that most newsrooms have today. But it wasn't always that way. Around this time, or even slightly before,
Yeah.
many of these media organizations, these newspapers, were highly partisan, right? They didn't.
Absolutely, and proudly so. Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that? How did these reporters and publishers in particular, how did they go about their day trying to determine what to publish, if the overall goal of most of these newspapers wasn't to be a government watchdog, for example?
Yes, clearly we were not talking about a time where in the early days there were newsrooms. There were publishers, editors, and they decided what went in, and et cetera, et cetera. And the first one has stuck particularly in my mind, Ben Harris, who was a Brit, who was very loud anti-Catholic, and came here and started across from the old State House. A little shop was selling coffee, a coffee house, the London Coffee House. And in the back, he put a printing machine and started printing the Public Occurrences, the first newspaper in America, in 1690, September 25th, 1690. And in that, he had stories about fires, about disease, about wars, about the Indians and the troubles Europeans had with the Indians, et cetera, et cetera. But his creed was printed in the first part of his newspaper, his beliefs. Before the story started, at the time we're not talking about even the headline. We're talking paragraph after paragraph. In the first part of his paper, in italics, he described how he was going to do his job. He said, I promise to produce a monthly newsletter here, unless there's a great demand, a great plethora of news, and then we'll publish more frequently. But then I promise to only use information that I can trust, that I get from people I trust. If I make a mistake, he's promising that in 1690. If I make a mistake, I promise to correct it in the next issue. And if I catch somebody giving me false information, I will expose him or her next time in the newspaper as a villain. So this is a promise that he made in 1690s. I think he set the standards, very high standards. Unfortunately, he was closed down 4 days after he appeared because his newspaper could cause grief to the British, and therefore they closed him down, and they said, well, he needed to have a license, etc., etc. So he never published again. The only issue that we have is in the London archives, and it came here as on a loan to the Boston Public Library. So I took my students and we walked to the BPL and we saw the first newspaper. It's a small issue, and we had behind glass and police and guns or whatever. So that's where our first newspaper is. It is not here. It's in London.
Let's put that into a broader context, because we're talking about Ben Harris here in Public Occurrences. This is about 150 years prior to the Ponzi scheme story that you talked about here. And you have an individual here who's at a time in our country where it's 1690, we are not yet a country. There's no constitution. There's no such thing as a First Amendment, and this right of the press to be a check on government hasn't been fully even formed yet. But yet you have someone like Ben Harris who says, you know, I'm going to take this role upon myself and really buck the trend. Because at the time, you know, most of these newspapers, right, they weren't publishing news stories. They were publishing maybe minutes of government proceedings or religious hymns, but they weren't doing what Harris wanted to do.
The major preachers of Boston had a big hand in this, and they submitted their essays, and the papers printed those. So that's what the text was at the time. And then, of course, the major discussion was independence. So that immediately brings to mind Isaiah Thomas and the Massachusetts Spy. He was publishing in today's what's that house? It's Oyster House. His office is still there in the Oyster House in Boston. The building is still there, very small building. And he was very much for pro-independence, and the Brits started to go after him. So one day he took his printing machine and went to Worcester, where he published for another 60 years without fear. But independence was the topic. Another topic that is very reminiscent of today was disease and inoculation. And our good friend, and at the time, inoculation was a very controversial thing. You're putting a virus inside somebody else's body. There is no way this could succeed, and therefore we object. This is a death sentence. Don't do it. Until Zebediah Boylston, the physician, inoculated his son, and that succeeded, and that changed people's minds, and that's how we have inoculation. And the other topics, as I said, were wars, fires, a poor farmer who killed himself because his wife had died recently, so he was very depressed. And these stories are not unlike what we see in today's papers. And then you have the inoculation issue, disease, and fires, and crime. So this is what the climate was like in early Boston.
Which is so fascinating to think about this era, because you have independence for the country on the horizon, and you have these newspapers that are starting to figure out what role they're going to play in this budding country once it's formed, and you have, you know, rebellion in the air. You have independence being talked about in the streets, and you know, one person that comes to mind that, you know, that came from all of this, though later in the late 1800s, was Maria Stewart. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Maria was the first African American woman to practice journalism in Boston and perhaps in America. She worked for Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. She was a maid in the beginning. She got whatever education she could on her own, and she started making speeches about the importance of the rights of women and Black women. And she eventually, Garrison started to print her sermons, and she was the first American woman to address a male and female audience at the same time, which was then called promiscuous. She was the first woman to address a promiscuous audience in the United States. Yeah, she's one of those rare people that pass through our streets.
You and I could speak for the next 3 hours on all of the stories that came out of Newspaper Row and the backgrounds of all of these publishers. But we have a short time today, and I appreciate you giving us just a little tease as what the life was like back then and how it played a role in really shaping not only our democracy moving forward, but the role that journalism plays in it then and now and likely moving into the future.
Yes,
so
it has been an honor for me to be teaching journalism in Boston. And every September 25th, I'll take my students to the Boston Common bandstand and read out loud the articles of the first newspaper. Unbelievable. And something else, Justin, the first American newspaper had only, it had 4 pages, only 3 of which had text. And the challenge for you is for you to guess what happened to the 4th paper. Why was the 4th page blank?
Why?
There is no way that you can guess this. So people can write their own stories and pass them to the neighbors.
Are you kidding?
So could that be a blog?
It could,
In 1690s?
it could be.
Think
That's
of
a
that.
very precursor to what we have today,
yes,
for sure.
Unbelievable. Anyway.
Fantastic stories. Professor, thank you again for joining us and
Thank you.
sharing these stories.
Thank you for inviting me.